The Red Forest. Within minutes of the April 1986 explosion at Reactor Number 4, a 10-square-kilometer stand of Scots pine, standing closest to the plant, absorbed a dose of radiation so extreme that the trees began dying almost immediately, their green needles turning a strange ginger-brown color within days. That forest, absorbing an estimated total radioactive contamination equivalent to 20 times the combined atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, remains the single most contaminated stretch of vegetation on the entire planet nearly 4 decades later. Soviet cleanup crews eventually bulldozed the dead trees into trenches, buried them under a layer of sand, and replanted young pine saplings directly on top, though the underlying soil contamination never actually went away. Scientists studying the surviving pines growing near the original blast site have documented measurable DNA damage persisting in shoot tips and needles even today, alongside unusual increases in resin ducts and cellular abnormalities that simply do not appear in pine trees growing outside the contaminated zone. Because the buried trench material still holds enormous quantities of long-lived radioactive isotopes, ongoing wildfire risk in the region carries an added danger beyond ordinary forest fire. The very real possibility of radioactive smoke redistributing contamination far beyond the current exclusion boundary. Access to the Red Forest remains tightly restricted even for researchers, and simply walking through the area without proper protective equipment can deliver a meaningful radiation dose within a remarkably short window of exposure. Guided tours of the wider exclusion zone now deliberately avoid the deepest portions of the Red Forest entirely, keeping visitors on routes where measured radiation levels stay within limits considered safe for a brief, supervised visit. The radiation-eating fungus. 5 years after the disaster, scientists exploring the ruins of the destroyed reactor discovered something that should not have been possible: thick, black fungal growth thriving directly on the walls of one of the most radioactive structures ever built by humans. The dominant species, Cladosporium sphaerospermum, along with related black fungi including Cryptococcus neoformans, contains high concentrations of melanin, the same pigment responsible for human skin color. And researchers eventually proved that this melanin was capturing ionizing radiation and converting it directly into usable chemical energy through a process now called radiosynthesis. Laboratory experiments have since shown these fungi actually growing faster when exposed to radiation levels roughly 500 times higher than normal background levels, essentially treating gamma radiation the way an ordinary plant treats sunlight. Every entry in this video traces back to real, peer-reviewed research conducted inside the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, and Garden's lab keeps digging into extreme environmental science exactly like this, with a new deep dive posted every few days for anyone who assumed nothing could actually thrive inside a nuclear disaster site. Researchers are now studying whether these radiation-hungry fungi could eventually help shield astronauts from cosmic radiation during long-duration space missions. A genuinely unexpected legacy for an organism first discovered growing on the walls of a collapsed nuclear reactor. Early experiments have even tested thin fungal coatings as a potential radiation shield, finding measurable reductions in radiation passing through the layer compared to an equivalent unshielded surface. The Decontamination Sunflowers. In 1994, an international research team planted vast rafts of sunflowers directly onto contaminated ponds near the destroyed reactor, testing whether the plant's famously aggressive root system could pull dangerous radioactive isotopes out of the water. The results proved remarkable, with sunflowers removing as much as 95% of the radioactive cesium and strontium from the treated ponds within just days. Since both isotopes closely mimic nutrients, potassium and calcium respectively, that sunflowers naturally seek out and absorb in large quantities. That success came with an important limitation, since the same technique later attempted at the Fukushima nuclear disaster site largely failed, because cesium binds tightly to certain clay minerals in solid soil in a way it never does in open water, leaving the isotope essentially locked away from any plant's root system. The sunflowers used in these cleanup efforts were never meant to be harvested for food or replanted afterward, since every absorbed isotope remained concentrated inside the plant tissue itself, meaning the flowers effectively became a form of contaminated waste requiring careful disposal once the experiment concluded. Despite the mixed results across different disaster sites, the Chernobyl Sunflower Project remains one of the most frequently cited real-world demonstrations of phytoremediation ever conducted anywhere in the world. The forest that won't decay. Researchers who began studying the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone in 1991 eventually noticed something deeply strange building up on the forest floor. Decades of fallen leaves and dead branches that showed almost no sign of ever breaking down. A controlled study finally confirmed the cause, placing bags of leaf litter across sites with varying radiation levels and finding that samples from the most contaminated locations retained roughly 60% of their original weight after a full year, compared to normal forest sites where 70 to 90% of the same material would have already decomposed. The radiation, it turned out, was suppressing the microbes and fungi responsible for recycling dead organic matter back into the soil, leaving behind a slowly accumulating layer of dry, undecayed fuel across the forest floor. That buildup has become a genuine long-term hazard, since decades of unburned kindling now blanket some of the most radioactive ground on the planet, raising real concern that a large wildfire could eventually redistribute radioactive smoke well beyond the boundaries of the current exclusion zone. Slower decomposition also means fewer nutrients cycling back into the soil, a secondary effect researchers believe is partly responsible for the noticeably reduced growth rate observed in trees across the most heavily contaminated stretches of forest. The radioactive mushrooms. Because fungi absorb nutrients directly through their surface tissue rather than through roots and leaves like ordinary plants, wild mushrooms growing across a wide swath of Europe still bioaccumulate measurable levels of cesium-137 nearly 40 years after the original fallout settled into forest soil. Unlike agricultural land, which gets regularly plowed and replanted, forest soil changes remarkably little over time, allowing radioactive cesium to remain concentrated in the same top 10 centimeters of ground, where fungal networks continue actively feeding decade after decade. Certain species prove far more prone to concentrating radiocesium than others, with some studied specimens registering activity levels thousands of times higher than the surrounding soil itself, while other mushroom species from the exact same forest patch show comparatively minimal contamination. Government radiation monitoring agencies across parts of Germany, Austria, and Poland continue actively testing wild mushroom harvests today, and while officials generally consider moderate, occasional consumption safe for the general public, certain individual specimens still occasionally exceed regulatory safety limits for radioactive contamination. This lingering contamination stands as one of the clearest, most literal reminders that Chernobyl's fallout never actually disappeared. It simply settled into a forest food web that continues quietly cycling radioactive material through mushrooms, wild berries, and game animals to this day. Species that form close symbiotic relationships with tree roots tend to concentrate the highest levels of all, since that same underground network built for exchanging nutrients with a host tree turns out to be equally efficient at pulling in radioactive cesium sitting nearby in the soil. The Pripyat urban forest. Once home to nearly 50,000 residents, the purpose-built Soviet city of Pripyat sat completely empty within 36 hours of the disaster, and in the decades since, the surrounding forest has methodically reclaimed almost every street, courtyard, and building the city once contained. Poplar, willow, and birch saplings pushed up through cracked asphalt and building foundations almost immediately after evacuation, and mature trees now grow directly through the floors of apartment buildings, gymnasiums, and the city's abandoned amusement park, their root systems slowly prying apart concrete that Soviet engineers assumed would stand for generations. Satellite imagery comparing Pripyat before and after abandonment shows a genuinely dramatic transformation. An entire planned city of wide boulevards and apartment blocks now almost completely hidden beneath a dense, unbroken forest canopy, visible from directly overhead. Ecologists studying the site describe the transformation as one of the most complete and rapid examples of urban rewilding ever documented anywhere on Earth. A functioning modern city reduced to scattered concrete fragments buried inside advancing woodland in less time than a single human generation. Structural engineers now warn that many of Pripyat's remaining buildings face collapse risk driven directly by decades of unchecked root growth working steadily through their foundations, meaning the forest itself may ultimately finish demolishing what radiation alone never fully destroyed. The adapting trees. Beyond the dramatic death of the Red Forest, researchers studying the wider Chernobyl Exclusion Zone have documented something more subtle happening in trees that survived lower, chronic radiation exposure over multiple generations. Measurable signs of enhanced DNA repair activity compared to trees of the same species growing in uncontaminated regions. That adaptation suggests certain plant populations within the zone may be gradually evolving. Improved tolerance to radiation and heavy metal exposure, passing down slightly better cellular repair mechanisms to each successive generation, growing on the same contaminated ground. Researchers remain careful not to overstate this finding, since enhanced repair capability does not mean these trees are thriving despite radiation, only that some lineages appear to be coping somewhat more effectively than would otherwise be expected after decades of continuous low-level exposure. This slow generational adaptation offers one of the more genuinely hopeful data points to emerge from the exclusion zone, suggesting that given enough time, plant life may eventually find at least partial biological solutions to environmental damage once assumed to be permanent and unchanging. Ongoing genetic studies continue tracking these populations specifically to determine whether the observed changes represent true evolutionary adaptation or simply the survival of individuals that happen to already carry more resilient genetics before the disaster ever occurred. The expanding exclusion zone forest. Since the evacuation of roughly 115,000 people from the surrounding region in 1986, the complete removal of farming, logging, and land development across more than 2,000 square kilometers has allowed forest cover across the exclusion zone to expand dramatically, reclaiming farmland, pastures, and cleared woodland that had been actively managed for generations before the disaster. That accidental, unplanned experiment in rewilding now ranks among the largest and most closely studied examples anywhere in Europe, offering ecologists a rare opportunity to observe exactly how quickly forest ecosystems recover once every form of human land pressure disappears simultaneously and completely. Today, the zone functions as one of the continent's largest de facto nature reserves, and international conservation organizations have since partnered with Ukrainian authorities specifically to study and help manage the unplanned forest expansion continuing to unfold across the region. Despite radiation levels that remain measurably elevated across large portions of the zone, researchers studying the site consistently conclude that the ecological benefit of removing human activity entirely has outweighed the biological cost of chronic low-level radiation exposure for the plant communities now reclaiming the landscape. The result stands as an unplanned, unintentional case study still actively unfolding today, proof that vegetation left completely undisturbed can reclaim and reshape an entire industrial landscape within a single human lifetime. Aerial surveys conducted at regular intervals since the disaster continue tracking exactly how far that forest expansion has spread, documenting a slow but steady green transformation of a landscape once dominated entirely by farmland and industry.